Math 3, Unit 2, Section 4. Today we are talking about factoring and solving quadratic equations. So remember, quadratic is when we're going to see a squared term. Okay? When you are factoring, the first thing that you always do is look for the GCF, the greatest common factor. Okay? The greatest common factor is anything that the entire problem has in common. Okay? And so here is an example. The GCF was 5x. They factored out the 5x. These each have 5x in common, so to show you what happened is they're dividing each of those terms by 5x and reducing. Okay? And so the 5x, the GCF goes in front. You have your parentheses. When this reduces, 10 divided by 5 is 2. X squared divided by x leaves you with just an x. Here, the x's completely cancel, and 55 divided by 5 leaves you with 11. The whole thing is that you need to remember is that you would need to multiply, if you were to distribute and multiply this back out, it should go back to the original question. Okay? All right. Another type of factoring is if you have the difference of two squares. Okay? And so difference is subtraction. If there was a plus there, that would not be a difference of two squares. Okay, so difference has to have a subtraction sign. If you check, I always check to make sure everything is a square, and I'll rewrite this as 3 squared x squared minus 7 squared. And so when you factor this, you're splitting up the squares. So if you notice in the front of each of these first parentheses, there are 3 x's, and at the end there are 7's, and one parenthesis gets a plus and one gets a minus. Okay? Difference of squares. Grouping. Sometimes you will have 4 terms. If you have 4 terms, you use the grouping method. If you see here how they've underlined each of the groups, with the 4 terms, you take out the GCF of each group. In this case, there was an x in common, so they took out an x, and you were left with a plus b. Here, the GCF was y, and you were left with a plus b. These parentheses have to match. You are now taking out the GCF a plus b, because they both have a plus b. So you take out the a plus b, and you're left with x plus y, and that is in the factored form. Pretty much, and as we go on to trinomials, we are going to end up changing these into grouping. Okay, and there were a couple steps here on this that were left off, but when you are factoring trinomials, you always take the coefficient in front and multiply it to the back. I like to set up a little chart. Okay, when you multiply 2 times 6 together, what does that make? 12. So 12 is my multiplication number. And so I normally just write it out so I don't forget what I'm trying to do. Your middle number is 7. So 7 is your addition number. And so then you're going through and thinking about all the numbers that multiply to be 12 and add to be 7. And the numbers that you come up with here are positive 3 and positive 4. So what happens is that this 7x right here, you split it into 3x plus 4x. Okay, and then you continue by factoring by grouping. And so this is where we would end up grouping the first 2 terms together and the last 2 terms together. The GCF of the first group, if you notice here, is 2x, and you're left with x plus 4. The GCF of the second group is 3, and you're left with x plus, not 4, what should it be? X plus 2. And so what has happened here? Oh, this also should be, when we took out the 2x, it should be x plus what? 2. So both of these should be 2. And so if you notice, these have to match. So what I was confused by, if you notice, is that one was 2 and one was 4, and it didn't work. So you knew you made a mistake. So if that ever happens, you go back and check. And so this should actually end up being x plus 2, and then 2x plus 3. Okay. Are there any questions up to this point? So now we're just going to start practicing. Okay? Again, when factoring, you always want to look for GCF first. Okay? Then, depending on how many terms there are, it might be difference of squares or trinomial factoring. Okay. Also be aware that some equations might factor more than once. So, moving on here. This first one, they are telling us that most of these, you need to make sure to focus on factoring out the GCF. It's not going to tell you this in your homework. Okay? But on number 1, what would be the GCF? X. Okay? If you struggle with any of this, some of you can do this in your head, which is okay with me. But if you aren't doing this correctly, then you would want to write what you're doing. So since I'm taking out the GCF of x, I'm dividing each of these by x. When you reduce this, x and x squared reduces, and you're just left with an x. Minus, here the x is reduced, and we're left with a 10. And I can't factor that further. That is my answer. What is my GCF for number 2? Good, just 5. And so we divide each of these by 5, and what am I left with? Good, x squared plus 5. Can this factor further? No. Okay, because we only have 2 terms, and is there a difference here? No. Okay, number 3. What would be our GCF on this one? Okay, let's say somebody said 4x. I'm just going to, you don't have to write 4x, but I'm going to do 4x here first because I want to show you that you want to double check things. So if I were to divide each of these by 4x, 16 divided by 4 is 4x, and then here 32 divided by 4 makes 8. Looking at this, do you see how there's still another 4 that could have been taken out? And so at that point you're like, oops, I could have taken out another 4. And so you're going to take out another 4 as a GCF. So in front, I have now a 4 and a 4x. And when I divide each of these by 4 now, I'm left with x minus 2. And what is 4 times 4x? 16x. So this is 16x and x minus 2. So if you don't quite, you should always double check and make sure you couldn't have taken out more. Does that make sense? Do we have questions here? All right. There's a typo here. That 0 should not be there. Okay. What is my GCF on number 4? Very good. 4x. So if we reduce each of these by 4x, what am I left with? X minus 4 is correct. All right, we're going to go ahead and move on here. So we are moving on to some more problems here. But what you need to remember is that we still want to check for GCF every time. Okay? Also, the way I'm going to be working these problems is we are going to do the first column down. And then we're going to go to the second one and so on. Okay, so starting here and moving down. If you go back to the trinomials, we always multiply our front coefficient with the end coefficient. If there isn't a number here, what's actually there? A 1. So we're going to multiply 1 times 16 together, and I'm going to make my little chart here. And what is 1 times 16? Good. And so 16 is my multiplication number. Yeah, nice try. Okay, what is my adding number? Good, -8 is my adding number. All right, so now we need to think through. What are 2 numbers that multiply to make a positive 16 and will add together to make a -8? Very good, -4 and -4. And so what happens is we end up changing our -8x into a -4x and a -4x. But the 16 at the end and the x squared at the front stay the same. All we're doing is changing that middle term. And if you notice that these two still add to be that middle term. Does anybody have questions up to this point? Okay, so now we have 4 terms, so what am I going to do? Good, we're going to do the GCF. Okay, we're going to split this up into our 2 terms, or 2 groups. What's my GCF of the first one? X. Okay, and what am I left with? X minus 4, very good. What's my GCF of the second group? Negative 4. Okay, notice that we have a minus in the middle here, and there's a plus in the middle here. In order to make that a minus in the middle, I have to take out a negative 4. Okay, and so, and if you want to write out dividing by negative 4 here, you can. And when I do that, I'm left with X minus 4, because 16 divided by negative 4 makes a negative 4. Okay, so do you see how these two match? That's kind of your check, okay? So what happens is, and I wasn't able to show you this before, but my GCF now is X minus 4. And what I'm doing is just like here, how I divided each of them by negative 4, I'm dividing each of these by X minus 4. So these are canceling here, and do you see how in front you have just the X minus 4 left over? So that is where that X minus 4. So these 2 parentheses, they're your GCF, and they make this X minus 4. And then whatever is left in front is what goes in your second parenthesis. Does it matter which order you write the parentheses in, though? No. And in this case, they're both the same. But if they were different, it doesn't matter. It's just that you need both of the parentheses there. Yes?
Since they're both the same, you could write X minus 4 squared. Right?
Yes. Or we could write this as X minus 4 squared. Yes. Question? Yes, we did this in math too. So this should be a review. That's why I was saying I hope you remember it. Okay. Do you guys think you're ready to try this one on your own? Okay, try it on your own. If you get the answer correct, or I mean, if you think you have the answer, raise your hand and I'm going to check it. And depending on how you do, we will move on.
Oh, that's 0, except for
Okay, from what I'm seeing is that we're going to put our cell phones away and that most of you got the answer correct. So I'm going to go through this one kind of quickly. This is a 1 in front. We multiply 1 times negative 20, which gives us negative 20 for my multiplication number. Okay, negative 1, if there isn't a number and there's really a negative 1 there in front, that is my adding number. The numbers that multiply to be negative 20 and add to be negative 1 are what? Good, negative 5 and 4. So that means this negative 1x is now becoming negative 5x and a positive 4x. Because when I add those together and simplify, it makes that negative 1. And then we rewrite everything else exactly how it was. So the x squared and the minus 20 stay the same. We group the first two and take out the GCF. And what is my GCF there? X, and I'm left with x minus 5. Very good. The GCF of the second group is 4, and I'm left with x minus 5. And so we see these parentheses match, which means I did it correct. And so my GCF now is x minus 5, and my other parenthesis is what is left over in front, because these two would cancel out, and I'd be left with x plus 4. Okay? If you had written this as a plus 4x and a minus 5x, when you factored, it would have looked slightly different, but your end result is the same. Okay? So either way, you're going to be good. Does anybody want me to go back to a step that happened here, or if you have a question about something? Nobody? Yes. So if you have a plus 5 here and a minus 4 here, if you add 5 and negative 4, that makes a positive 1. And so that doesn't fit our criteria. So the criteria is that it had to add to be a negative 1, and it had to multiply to be a negative 20. So that just means you put the wrong sign. Does that make sense? So you just always want to double check here. It's almost like you're solving a puzzle. So you're always trying to find those two numbers that fit both of these things. Okay? Did I answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? All right, I think we're going to skip this problem from now. We're going to move to the next column. So the only difference here is that here our leading coefficient was 1 when we multiplied, and here it's a number other than 1. And so, but we're going to solve it exactly the same way. And so just like here where I multiplied 1 over, I'm multiplying 2 over. Okay? And so what is 2 times negative 5? Negative 10. So negative 10 is my multiplying number. Notice that I always multiply to get my multiplying number. Okay? And then my middle number, 3, that is my adding number. So figuring out the puzzle, we're trying to figure out two numbers that multiply to be negative 10 and also at the same time add to make 3. Very good. 5 and negative 2. So do you see how when you multiply these, they make negative 10, and if you add them together, they make 3. Is that okay? So, again, we're going to split these up. It doesn't matter if you write a 5x first or a negative 2x. You'll end up with the same result. But I'm just going to go ahead and write this as 5x minus 2x. And then we bring the rest of this down. And this 5x is a positive. And so maybe you should put positive there. And then we bring down our 2x squared. And we bring down the minus 5. So the only thing that's changing is our middle term is changing into the two terms that we found that worked. Okay? Then we factor by grouping. What is my GCF of the first group? X. And I'm left with what? 2x plus 5. If you ever don't have a GCF in the second group, your GCF is 1. Okay? In this case, there isn't a GCF, but I want it to all be positive. And so what am I actually going to take out? What's going to be my GCF? A negative 1. Good. And so we're going to take out a negative 1. We divide by negative 1 to each of these terms, if you need to see that. And we end up with what? 2x plus 5. Do these parentheses match? Yes. So we know we did it correctly. And so how am I going to end up writing my answer? 2x plus 5 and x minus 1. Could I have written x minus 1 and then 2x and then 2x plus 5? Yes. But you have to make sure that everything within each of the parentheses is the same. But the order of the parentheses doesn't matter. Are you guys ready to try this one on your own? Or do we need to do this one on together? No, we're okay? All right, so start working. If you need help, raise your hand. And if you get the answer, raise your hand.
to, you add to it and then make a positive person, because 5 minus 2 is positive 3, and 5 times negative 2 is negative 5.
All right, so we're kind of, did you get it? Okay, so the correct answer, you should have had 5x minus 3 and x minus 1. So let's go ahead and work through this one. So the first thing I'm going to do is 5 times 3, which is what? 15. So 15 is my multiplication number. Okay? My adding number is negative 8. So what numbers worked? Negative 5 and negative 3. Because two negatives you add and it stays negative, but when multiplying, two negatives end up making a positive. Now, where some of you messed up is that your 5x squared and your 3 stay the same. The only thing that's changing is our negative 8x. Okay? So I'm going to write 5x squared, but instead of negative 8x, this is where we split it up into these two, which is a negative 5x and a negative 3x. and then I still keep my plus 3. So my only thing when I start solving it that changes is where I'm splitting our middle term into 2 terms. Okay, from there now we are going to factor by grouping. What is the GCF of my first group? There's a 5 and an x, correct? And so my GCF is 5x. So we're going to divide each of these by 5x. And what does 5x squared divided by 5x reduce to? X. Good. And then here, negative 5x divided by 5x, it all cancels out, which means there's a... Very good. My next group, what am I going to factor out? A negative 3. And the reason is I don't want my first term in my parenthesis to be negative. Okay, so I'm taking out a negative 3. I'm factoring, or I'm dividing by negative 3 to each term, and I'm left with x, and 3 divided by negative 3 makes negative 1. My parentheses match. So what is my GCF? X minus 1. And just to visually show some of you, this basically right here is 1 term, and this is 1 term. And so between these 2 terms, they each have x minus 1 in common. And so I'm dividing by x minus 1 to both of these. And when I do that, these cancel out. I have my x minus 1 in front, just like how when these had in common a 5x, and I had my 5x in front. Now I have my x minus 1 in front, and I'm left with 5x minus 3. Because that's what's left over in front of my x minus 1s. Okay, what? Ask me a question. Okay, I think we need to do these problems. So we're going to do number 2 here first. Actually, we're going to do number 1. We're going to do 1 and 2, and this is all we're going to get to today, just so you know. Okay, so on number 1, if there is ever not a coefficient in front, we put a 1 there, okay? 1 times negative 27 is what? Negative 27, and that's my multiplication number. 6 is my adding number. What numbers are going to work? Very good. 9 and negative 3. And again, remember, this is like a puzzle. You're just trying to figure out the 2 numbers that fit both of these criteria. Okay? So 9 minus 3 is 6. 9 times negative 3, negative 27. So we rewrite the problem. I keep x squared, but my 6x changes into these 2. Okay? So that is a positive 9x and a minus 3x. And I keep my minus 27 at the end. So I'm going to stop here. I want you to ask me questions. For some of you, this is different than how your teacher taught you last year. This method, the way that we're doing this, works for every single type of problem. And it's going to help you as you move on in math. Okay? So 4 terms, split it into 2 separate groups. In the first group, what's my GCF? X, and I'm left with what? X plus 9. What is my GCF of this second group? Good. Negative 3, and what am I left with? X plus 9. They both have x plus 9s in common. And so what do? I'm factoring out an x plus 9. So my final answer will be x plus 9 and x minus 3. Questions? Okay, number 2, this is where some of you, if you went ahead, may have made a mistake. But what do we always check for first? Yeah, a GCF. Do we have a GCF? What is the GCF? 3. The first thing on this problem that you should do is factor out a GCF. If you didn't, you're going to end up with not exactly what you want. So when I take out the GCF of 3, I'm dividing everything by 3, and so I have a 3 in the front, and then my x squared plus 3x minus 4. And then we need to factor it further. One thing you need to be careful about is that this 3 is part of the answer, but I'm not going to use that in order to factor in here. And so that I don't forget, I oftentimes like to bring my GCF down to like where I'm going to write my answer so that I don't forget to write it. Because right now all I'm going to do is focus on my leftover part. Okay, what is going to end up being my multiplication number? -4, because right now we're only looking at everything except for the GCF that I already factored out. So there's really a 1 in front of the x squared, and 1 times -4 is -4. And what is my adding number? A +3. So what numbers are going to work? Very good. 4 and -1 are correct. When you add them, it makes a 3. When you multiply them, it makes a -4. Okay. So now, what will I do? We have to rewrite our problem, correct? What am I going to write first? Very good. 1x squared, or x squared. And then what happens to my 3x? A +4x and a, very good, -1x, and then perfect. Now I will split it into 2 groups. What is the GCF of my first group? X, very good. And what am I left with? X plus 4. What is my GCF of the second group? -1, good. And what will I be left with? Very good. And so my final answer, good, x plus 4 and x minus 1, but don't forget here, and that's why I brought the 3 to the bottom, that I actually write this as 3 times x plus 4 and x minus 1. Do we have questions here?